The morning I found the snow disturbed around my woodpile, I stood there in my boots for a long time. Just stood there. The cold coming up through my soles. The sky still gray and low the way it gets in February up here near Sudbury, and I couldn't move. Not because of the cold, because of what I was looking at. Let me back up a few days. I'd driven into town on the Thursday. Nothing special. I needed rock salt, a prescription refill, and I was going to pick up a bag of birdseed from the co-op on the way home. It was the kind of errand day I've had 100 times since my wife passed. You build a routine after you lose someone. You have to. Otherwise, the days just blur into each other, and you end up sitting in the kitchen at 2 in the afternoon still in your robe. The pharmacy on Larch Street was quiet that afternoon. I was third in line. In front of me was a man I didn't recognize. Tall, maybe my age, early 60s, wearing one of those old Carhartt jackets that's been washed so many times it's gone from brown to something closer to sand. He had a cane, but he wasn't leaning on it much, more like he was carrying it out of habit. When he got to the counter, I could hear the pharmacist explain, quietly but not quietly enough, that his provincial coverage had a gap this month, something about a formulary change. The old man reached into his jacket pocket, pulled out his wallet, opened it, and I could see from where I stood that there wasn't much in there. He asked her how much without the coverage. She told him. He stood very still. I don't know why I did what I did. Another type of man who makes a show of anything. My father raised me to keep my head down, work hard, and mind my own business. But I was standing there watching this man do the math in his head, and I just stepped forward and said, quietly as I could, that I'd cover it. He turned around and looked at me. Not grateful right away, more like suspicious. I think that's the Canadian in him. We don't like receiving charity, and we don't trust it when it's offered without strings. I told him it wasn't a big deal. I told him I'd been on the other side of that counter once myself. Which was true. A few years back, after a billing error with my insurance from the mill, I'd had to leave a prescription behind. It's a lousy feeling. I didn't want him to have it. He let me pay. The pharmacist ran it through. The man put his medications in his jacket pocket and turned to face me fully. He had sharp eyes, dark brown, still clear despite his age. He looked at me for a moment, the way someone looks at a person when they're deciding whether to say something. Then he said, "You've got the Crawford property, out on the Vermilion Lake Road." It wasn't a question. I said yes. I'd had it about 14 years. He nodded slowly, like he was confirming something to himself. "Your son is coming to stay," he said. I didn't answer right away. It was true. My son had called the week before to say he was driving up from Hamilton with his girlfriend. He hadn't visited in almost 2 years. The old man held my gaze and said low and even, "When he leaves, don't clear the snow from around the woodpile." And then he turned and walked out. I stood there. The pharmacist handed me my own bag. I said thank you without really hearing myself say it. Don't clear the snow from around the woodpile. I drove home with that sitting in my chest like a stone. My son, I'll call him by what I call him, which is son, because that's how I've always thought of him, was 34 that winter. He'd had a rough few years, or so he told me. Lost a job in logistics, moved in with his girlfriend, moved out again, moved back. There were debts he didn't talk about directly, but that came up sideways, in comments about how expensive everything was, how the system was rigged, how people like him couldn't get a fair shot. I listened. I always listened. I sent money when he asked, which was more often than I would have liked, but he was my boy, and that's what you do. His girlfriend, I'll call her by what she was, his girlfriend, had never made much of an impression on me. Not unfriendly, not warm either. The kind of person who smiles at you with their mouth while their eyes are somewhere else. They arrived on a Saturday afternoon. I'd made chili. My son hugged me at the door, clapped me on the back, said I looked good. His girlfriend stood behind him and said the drive had been long. I showed them to the spare room, the one that had been his growing up. She looked around it like she was appraising it. I noticed that. I noticed a lot that weekend, actually, in a way I hadn't in previous visits. Something the old man had said had put a kind of attention in me that I usually keep turned down. That first evening we ate together, and my son talked about Hamilton, about a business idea he had, something to do with the storage and moving company he wanted to start, with someone he'd met online. He needed startup capital. I could hear where the conversation was going before it arrived. I didn't say anything to hurry it along. His girlfriend excused herself after dinner. My son and I sat with our tea. He told me he needed $40,000. I put my mud down. He said he knew it was a lot. He said he'd pay it back. He said the business plan was solid, that his partner had connections, that they already had 2 clients lined up. He used the word guaranteed more than once, which is always the word I trust least. I told him I needed to think about it. He didn't like that. His face did something I recognized from when he was a teenager, a tightening around the eyes, a slight pull at the corner of his mouth. He said he'd thought I'd be more supportive. I said I was plenty supportive. I just needed to think before I moved $40,000 out of a retirement account. We didn't fight. We rarely fight outright. We just went to our separate parts of the house. The next morning, I woke up early, the way I always do, and I looked out the kitchen window toward the woodpile and the tree line beyond it, and I thought about the old man on Larch Street, and I thought, what did he know? On the Sunday evening, my son told me they'd be leaving Monday morning. He said his girlfriend had something she needed to get back to. He was stiff with me, formal, the way he gets when he's hurt. I made eggs for breakfast Monday and he was civil. His girlfriend smiled with her mouth. They loaded the car. He hugged me at the door again, shorter this time, said he'd call. And then they were gone. I stood in the house for a few minutes, just breathing. The quiet after a visit is always particular, thicker than regular quiet, heavier. Then I thought about what the old man had said. I put on my boots and my coat and I walked out to the woodpile. And that's when I stopped moving. The snow around the woodpile had been disturbed, not by an animal. I know what that looks like. The scattered tracking, the random paths. This was purposeful. There were boot prints coming from the side of the house, moving around the back of the woodpile in a deliberate arc, then back again. 2 sets, I thought. Maybe the same person going and returning. Or 2 people. I crouched down and looked closer. On the ground, just behind the second row of stacked wood, there was a flap of tarpaulin I didn't recognize. It wasn't mine. I used blue tarps and this one was green army surplus. I pulled it back. Underneath were 3 packages wrapped in black garbage bags, sealed with duct tape. Each one about the size of a hardcover book. I didn't touch them. I stood up. My heart was doing something I didn't like. Hard. Fast. Too high in my chest. I've been around long enough to know that you don't handle things you don't understand, and you definitely don't bring them inside your house. I went inside and called the OPP non-emergency line. 2 officers came out within the hour. They were professional, quiet, didn't make me feel like I was wasting their time. They photographed the boot prints. They took the packages. They didn't tell me right away what was in them, but one of the officers, a woman in her 40s with a calm that I found steadying, told me I'd done exactly the right thing by not touching anything. Later that afternoon, she called me back. She said the packages contained a quantity of controlled substances consistent with distribution-level possession. She said they were going to need to speak with my son. I sat down at the kitchen table and I stayed there for a while. I want to be honest about what I felt because I think people expect you to feel one thing in a moment like that, and usually it's more complicated. I felt betrayal, yes. That hollow, scooping feeling in your gut when someone you love does something that reorganizes everything you thought you understood about them. But I also felt something else underneath it. A kind of terrible clarity, like the last piece of a puzzle you'd been hoping wouldn't fit anywhere actually clicking into place. All the money, all the vague explanations, all the visits that ended with an ask. I thought about his girlfriend standing in the spare room, looking around with those appraising eyes. I thought about how she'd excused herself after dinner and how long she'd been out of the room. I thought about the old man in the pharmacy. I called my son that evening. He didn't answer. I left a message, kept it short, told him we needed to talk. He called back 2 hours later and his voice was different right away. Tight, careful, like someone who already knows the shape of the conversation. I told him the OPP had been out to the property. I told him what they'd found. There was a silence on the line that lasted long enough that I checked to see if the call had dropped. Then he said it wasn't what it looked like. I've been alive for 63 years. I've heard that sentence before. It means it is exactly what it looks like. I told him quietly, without raising my voice, that I would not be speaking with him again until he spoke with a lawyer and cooperated with the officers investigating. I told him I loved him. I told him that hadn't changed and it never would. But I also told him that love doesn't mean allowing your home to be used as a dead drop, and it doesn't mean pretending I didn't know what I'd found. He hung up. I put the phone down on the table and looked out the window at the woodpile in the fading light. In the days that followed, I learned, through the officers, that the woman he brought with him had a history, that the business partner in Hamilton was known to them, that my son had been on the edge of this world for longer than I'd understood, pulled in by debt and by people who were very good at finding men who were desperate and convincing them there's a quick way out. He was not charged. The quantity found wasn't traced back to him directly, and there were complications in the investigation that I don't fully understand. But the experience shook something loose in him. He called me 3 weeks later from a different number. Sounding nothing like himself, he said he'd ended things with his girlfriend. He said he'd been talking to someone, a counselor through his work benefits. He said he was sorry. We talked for a long time that night. Really talked, the way we hadn't in years. I told him about the old man in the pharmacy. I told him what the man had said to me, and that I'd listened, though I hadn't understood it. My son was quiet for a moment. Then he asked me who the man was. I didn't know. I'd never seen him before, and I haven't seen him since. He knew me, knew the property, knew my son was coming. I've thought about it 100 times, and I have no explanation that satisfies me. Sudbury is a small enough city that people know things. Connections exist that you don't see. Maybe he'd overheard something somewhere. Maybe he'd seen something. Maybe it was simpler than I was making it and he just knew my son from somewhere I didn't. Or maybe sometimes a small act of decency, paying for a stranger's prescription on a gray Thursday afternoon, comes back to you in a form you never could have anticipated. I'd like to believe that. I think I do believe it. The woodpile is still there. I restacked it in the spring, added another cord. I split myself over 2 weekends, which was more work than my back appreciated, but which did me good in a way I can't quite explain. There's something about physical work on the land you own. It reminds you that you're still here, that things still belong to you, that no one took what was yours. My son came up for a weekend in July. Just him, no one else. We fished off the dock in the evenings and didn't talk about any of it, not directly. But one afternoon, while we were cleaning the catch on the back table, he stopped what he was doing and looked out across the water for a long moment. Then he said quietly that he was grateful I hadn't called a lawyer on him, that I trusted him to handle it. I handed him the fish I'd been scaling and said that he was my son, and I'd trusted him his whole life, and I planned to keep doing it, but that trust needed to be earned back, and I believed he was doing that. He nodded, went back to work. That felt like enough. For now, it felt like enough. If you've made it this far, drop your city or province in the comments. I read every one of them. And if the story reminded you of something in your own life, I'd be glad to hear it. The good parts, and the hard ones both. I think about that Thursday afternoon at the pharmacy more than I probably should. A gray day, nothing remarkable about it. The kind of day that disappears into the blur of a winter month. And yet something I did in those 2 or 3 minutes, something small, instinctive, almost embarrassing in how ordinary it felt, came back to me in a form I never could have predicted. I didn't pay for that man's prescription because I expected anything. I want to be clear about that. I did it because I'd been on the other side of that counter once, and I knew the feeling, and I didn't want him to carry it home. That's all. There was no calculation in it. And I think that's exactly why it mattered. Because the things we do without thinking about the return are usually the truest things we do. They're the ones that show us who we actually are when nobody's keeping score. What the old man gave me wasn't a solution. It was attention. That warning put a kind of quiet alertness in me that I'd let go slack over the years with my son. I'd been so focused on not wanting to see what was in front of me that I'd stopped looking. A parent does that. You love someone so much that you start making excuses for the gaps in their story, filling them in with the version you'd prefer to be true. That's not wisdom. That's fear dressed up as loyalty. What I've had to reckon with. And I'm still reckoning with it. I won't pretend otherwise. Is that love without clear eyes isn't really love. It's protection of your own comfort. Real love means you stay present even when what you're seeing is hard. It means you don't look away. My son needed me to look at him honestly a long time before that February morning, and I hadn't. That's on me. I own that. But here's the other thing I've learned, and this one took me longer. Staying doesn't mean absorbing. I kept my son in my life. I kept the door open. I told him I loved him. In the same breath that I told him I wouldn't pretend. That balance, holding someone accountable while refusing to abandon them, that's the hardest thing I've ever tried to do as a father. Harder than any physical work I've done on that property, and I've done plenty. He's doing better now. I won't say he's fixed, because people aren't machines, and that's not how it works. But he came up in July and we fished together, and there were moments on that dock that reminded me of when he was 12 years old and the whole world was still simple. Those moments don't erase what happened, but they sit alongside it. That's what I've come to understand about hard things in a life. They don't go away. They just find their place in the larger picture of who you are and who the people you love are trying to become. I cleared the woodpile in April, once the ground was soft enough. Restacked every cord myself. My back complained for a week. I didn't mind.